My name is Eleanor Mathers, and I am 69 years old. I have always believed that grief should arrive with some kind of warning, a crack in the sky, or a sudden hush in the air. Something to signal that your world is about to fall apart. But when my only son James died, there was nothing. Just a cold Tuesday morning, and a phone call from a nurse whose voice was too calm for the news she carried. "Are you the mother of James Mathers?" she asked. And I felt something ancient inside me start to splinter. They told me it was his heart, sudden and massive, and that he didn't suffer. But those words meant nothing to me, because in the space between breaths, my entire reason for breathing was gone. James was 39. He had a crooked smile and eyes that always knew when I was lying about being okay. We lived together in his home for nearly a decade after my husband passed. I helped raise his daughter, Ava, from the moment she came into the world, rocking her through colic, singing lullabies at midnight, packing her lunches every morning with little notes that said things like, "You are stronger than you think." I was not just a guest in that house. I was part of its bones, the woman who washed the curtains every spring and taught Ava to braid her own hair. But none of that mattered after the call. The house went quiet in a strange way, not just from the absence of James's voice, but from something colder that crept in behind it. Vanessa, his wife, my daughter-in-law, stood in the hallway already dressed for the day, her face smooth and unreadable. When she looked at me, there was no softness in her eyes, only calculation. "You should probably start packing," she said, like I was some tenant whose lease had just expired. I stood there in my nightgown, holding the phone, the last trace of my son's life still echoing in my ears, and I realized I wasn't just grieving James. I was being erased. No one tells you that grief can be crueler when it's compounded by betrayal. I spent the day folding his clothes, each one a small memorial. I sat on his bed and pressed his sweater to my face, trying to hold on to something before the rest of my life was taken away. I wasn't just a mother who lost her son. I was a woman being pushed into the shadows of her own story. The sun went down that night without apology, and I watched the last light slip through the curtains like a secret no one wanted to hear. In that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. The dead are not the only ones who vanish. Sometimes the living are quietly asked to disappear too. The chapel smelled like lilies and old varnish, and I sat in the front row with my hands folded so tightly in my lap that the veins stood out like blue rivers, pulsing against my grief. I buried my only child on a grey afternoon that didn't have the decency to rain, because at least the sky could have mirrored the storm inside me. James's picture stood near the altar, smiling like he hadn't just left this world with no warning, no goodbye. People came in quiet waves, placing hands on my shoulder and whispering soft, useless things like, "He's in a better place," and "He'll always be with you," as if proximity to heaven could soothe the sharp edge of a mother's loss. Vanessa wore a black dress that fit like armor, her hair pulled into a sleek bun that didn't move when she cried, though I noticed she never really cried. Not once did she crumple. Not once did she reach for me. She stood by the casket like it was a business meeting, receiving people with polite nods, her eyes dry, her mouth fixed. I gave her space, thinking maybe she was holding herself together for Ava's sake. But as the last hymn ended, and the people began to file out, she turned to me with the calm finality of a person settling a transaction and said, "You should start packing when we get home. You're not needed here anymore." I didn't respond, not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't. Her voice was so measured, so deliberate. It took a moment for the meaning to land. She said it with the same tone someone might use to ask for the mail, like I was just some fixture that no longer matched the decor. I looked at her face, searching for the girl who used to bring me tea in the mornings after Ava was born, who once asked me how I made the gravy so smooth, who cried on my shoulder when James was in surgery for his knee. But that girl was gone, if she ever truly existed. What stood before me was someone who had already rearranged the furniture in her mind, placing me firmly outside the frame. I rose slowly, like someone waking from a bad dream, and followed her out into the parking lot where cars gleamed and conversations had already moved on. The funeral director shook my hand and offered his condolences. I thanked him with a hollow voice, watching as Vanessa guided Ava into the back seat without so much as a glance my way. I sat beside the urn in the car, holding my breath as if I might shatter if I exhaled. And in that silence, I heard my son's voice in my memory saying, "You're the glue, Mum," the heart of the house. But hearts can be cut out cleanly, apparently, and mine had just been handed an eviction notice. I stood at the threshold of the room I used to call mine, though I never asked for ownership, only belonging. And for a long time, it had been freely given. In that moment, I felt older than I ever had. The air inside was different now, scented faintly with fresh paint and lemon polish, like it was trying to erase what had come before. The walls, once soft lavender with Ava's drawings tacked neatly above my dresser, were now a crisp white, sterile and new, as though memory itself had been wiped clean. There were boxes lined against the wall, some taped, some left open like mouths mid-sentence, holding pieces of my quiet, useful life. My books, still dog-eared from years of reading fairy tales and bedtime prayers. The small music box James gave me the first Christmas after his father died, nestled among folded cardigans I no longer had room to wear. On the dresser sat a framed photo of Ava and me at the zoo, the one where she had cotton candy on her cheeks and my hat pulled too low, both of us laughing at something long forgotten. It had been placed to the side, as if waiting to be carried out. Even the lamp beside the bed had been changed, replaced with a sleeker model, all angles and chrome. But it was the absence of the smallest things that landed hardest. My toothbrush was gone from the bathroom. The mug with the chip I always used was no longer beside the kettle. My slippers were no longer beside the bed, and the blanket I had crocheted for Ava's crib had been folded and stored, as though sentiment had an expiration date. I stood in the middle of the room and tried to remember what it had felt like when this space was warm, when Ava would tiptoe in during thunderstorms and whisper, "Grandma, can I sleep with you?" When I would sing her lullabies, until her breathing evened out and the world softened. But now the floor creaked differently beneath my feet. The bed had new sheets. There was a suitcase on the chair, not mine. I felt like a ghost standing in the house of someone who used to love me. From the hallway, I heard voices. Vanessa on the phone, arranging a furniture pickup, her tone clipped and efficient. "The room's almost cleared," she said. "We'll need the dresser gone by Thursday." And just like that, I was a task on her to-do list. I walked back into the hallway and past the mirror, catching my reflection without recognizing it. My hair, now silver, fell softly against my cheeks, and my eyes, once full of light, stared back hollow. I had not only lost my son, I had lost my place in his home. The door clicked shut behind me like a final period on a sentence I had not been allowed to finish. The next morning arrived with the smell of burnt toast and too bright sunlight pouring through windows I used to clean every Friday. Back when time moved slower and love felt like something you could touch. I have never known the kind of silence that presses on your chest like a weight you cannot lift. Vanessa was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, perfectly put together in a cream blouse that didn't dare wrinkle, stirring her coffee like she was late for a board meeting instead of still living in the shadow of her husband's death. She didn't look up when she spoke. My father will be arriving at 11. He'll be staying in the guest room. We have a lot to sort out. That was all she said, before walking away, her heels clicking like punctuation marks on the hardwood floor. I stood there gripping my mug, the one with daisies on the side, the last remaining thing in the house that felt like mine, and I wondered what, exactly, needed sorting. At exactly 11, a silver BMW pulled up the drive, and out stepped Graham Whitmore, tall, tan and dressed like he'd just walked out of a country club brochure. He carried himself like a man who had never been told no. I'd met him only twice before, at holidays where he arrived late, talked too loud, and left early, offering Ava impersonal gifts and calling me dear, like he couldn't be bothered to remember my name. This time, he entered the house like he already owned it, placing his leather duffel on the bench by the stairs and surveying the room with narrowed eyes, as if mentally redecorating it to suit his taste. "Eleanor," he said, flashing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Tough times, huh? But don't worry, I'm here now. Vanessa and Ava will be well looked after." He patted my arm like I was a fragile chair on its last leg, and then made his way to the living room, sinking into James's old leather recliner like he'd been waiting years to sit in that spot. I stood frozen in the doorway as he crossed his legs and pulled out a legal pad, flipping through pages like the house was a business merger and I was just a legacy contract being phased out. Vanessa joined him on the sofa, and they began talking in hushed tones about insurance, accounts, school transfers, estate holdings, using words that felt too slick, too polished, for a family that had not yet let the ground settle over a coffin. No one asked me if I was all right. No one asked if I had eaten or slept, or if Ava had cried during the night. They talked around me, past me, through me, as if I had already packed and disappeared. And as Graham's laughter echoed off the walls of the home my son had built, I realized I was watching the future take root without me. It happened in the most unremarkable way, like a whisper hidden inside a storm, almost too quiet to hear unless you were already listening for something. I had nearly convinced myself that the only thing left for me to do was disappear with grace, to vanish from the rooms where I once mattered, and fold myself into memory like a pressed flower no longer in season. But life has a strange way of offering breadcrumbs when all you've been handed are stones. I was at the market, of all places, picking up milk and apples and a loaf of bread I would probably never eat, just to feel normal for a few minutes. That was when I saw David Langston near the produce section, adjusting his reading glasses and squinting at a list written in a looping hand that was not his. David had been James's college roommate and later his attorney, a kind man with a slow voice and eyes that always seemed to understand more than he said. He hugged me when he saw me and asked how I was doing, which nearly undid me because no one had asked me that in days. I didn't plan on saying much, but grief has a way of making honesty slip out. I told him the house felt like it was rearranging itself around me, like I was being gently but firmly erased. His brow furrowed when I mentioned Vanessa had already started sorting through James's things, and when I added that she told me to start packing, his lips tightened in a way that made me pause. He didn't speak for a moment, just shifted his weight like something heavy had landed on his shoulders. "Eleanor," he said slowly. "James came to see me a few months before he passed. He asked me to draft an updated will. My breath caught, and I gripped the cart like it might anchor me. He never told me he signed a new one," I said, the words dry in my mouth. David nodded. "He didn't tell many people, but he did sign it. We sealed it per his request. He said he needed time before making it official with Vanessa. But legally, it's still valid. It's dated and witnessed. If she hasn't mentioned it, then she either doesn't know or doesn't want you to know." My ears rang like bells underwater. The air shifted around me. A second will. Something hidden. Something living beneath the surface of all this silence. David promised to send me a copy. Said it needed to be handled delicately, with care. I left the market without the milk, the apples or the bread. I walked home slowly, the wind cold against my face, feeling for the first time not helpless but awake. There was more to my son's death than just the ache it left behind. There was a truth buried in ink and envelopes, and I was going to find it. The envelope arrived 2 days later, hand-delivered by a courier in a navy vest who barely made eye contact as he passed it to me like it was nothing more than an errand. I held that envelope with trembling fingers, knowing that whatever was sealed inside had the power to shift the ground I had been barely standing on. I took it upstairs, away from the echo of Vanessa's heels and the low murmur of her father's voice coming from the study, and sat on the edge of the bed that no longer felt like mine. The paper was thick, the kind that felt important before you even read a word. David's cover letter was brief and careful, reminding me this was a legally binding version of James's last will and testament, executed just over 4 months before his death. It began with the expected language, the dry phrasing of law and formality, but then came the part that made the air thicken in my lungs. In the event of my untimely death, I designate my mother, Eleanor Mathers, as a joint legal custodian of my daughter, Ava Rose Mathers. I trust her judgment implicitly and wish for her to retain active involvement in Ava's upbringing, living arrangements, education, and emotional care. I read those lines again and again, the words blurring until I pressed my palm to my mouth to stifle the sound that rose in my throat. It was James. His voice, his heart, his way of protecting me, even when he wasn't here. I could picture him sitting in David's office, probably fidgeting with his pen, speaking softly but firmly, the way he did when something truly mattered. He had known. Somehow, on some level, he had known. Or maybe he had simply seen what I had chosen not to see, that Vanessa's love was thin and her patience thinner, that without him, I would be discarded like a meal no one finished. I closed the document and folded it back into the envelope, smoothing the edges as if it were something sacred. Vanessa didn't know. I was sure of it. She had moved through the past week with a confidence that came from believing she held all the power. But now the truth sat in my nightstand drawer, quiet and waiting. I didn't feel vindictive. I didn't even feel triumphant. What I felt was the slow return of breath in my lungs, a piece of my name stitched back into the fabric of this home. This was not about control. It was about Ava, about the love I had poured into her life since the day she was born, about the promises James and I made late at night when she had colic and we took shifts walking the hallway. He had trusted me, and now that trust was written in ink. I had been pushed to the margins. But James had left me a thread, and I would follow it. I hadn't meant to open the drawer, not that one. It was the small one on the left side of James's desk, the one with the tiny brass keyhole he never used and never mentioned, but that I had always assumed held spare pens or outdated bills. I was gathering my things as quietly as a woman can when she is being erased, folding sweaters into neat piles and stacking books that had once lived beside Ava's bedtime routines, pretending I was preparing for a trip rather than an exile. The key had fallen from behind the desk organizer, a little bronze shape no larger than a housefly, and something in me knew it belonged to that drawer before I even tested it. It clicked open without effort, and inside was a single envelope. No files, no receipts. Just thick ivory paper with my name written across the front in James's looping hand. I sat down slowly. The way you sit when you feel something sacred or dangerous, pressing against your chest, and opened it with fingers that had raised that boy through skinned knees and fevered nights. The letter was dated exactly 2 weeks before he died. "Mum," it began, "if you're reading this, Then something went wrong, and I need you to know what I couldn't say aloud. My heart thudded in my ears as his words poured out, steady and careful, the way he always was when something mattered. He wrote about feeling tired, how the pressure at work was getting worse, how he had gone to the doctor for chest pains, but hadn't told Vanessa because she always dismissed things like that as dramatic. He wrote about Ava, about how much he adored her, how he worried that if anything happened to him, she might lose not only her father, but the one person who had always made her feel safe. He wrote about me. He said I was her anchor, her history, her softness, in a world that was already beginning to feel too sharp. You're the reason I can work late and still know she's loved, he wrote. You're the only one who sings to her when she's sick, who remembers her teacher's name, who knows the exact way she likes her apple slices. And then the line that cut through me like winter air. If Vanessa tells you to leave, promise me you won't. Promise me you'll fight, because I know she won't understand what Ava really needs, not the way you do. I folded the letter back into its envelope, tears slipping down my cheeks. Not for the first time since James died, but this time they were something else entirely. Not just grief, not just loss. They were a tether, a charge. Proof that I was not clinging to a role that had passed. I was fulfilling a promise. One written by the only person whose voice still lived in every corner of this house. The kitchen had always been my sanctuary. The one place in this house that still smelled like something I had touched, shaped, made real with my own two hands. That morning I was standing at the counter, peeling apples for Ava's favourite tart, pretending the world hadn't turned cold around me. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock, the knife moving through skin and fruit in clean rhythmic slices, all helped me forget that my son was gone and that I had been told, more than once and never kindly, that my presence was no longer required. That was when I heard the door swing shut behind me. Graham. He walked in like he owned the walls, wearing one of those shirts that looked ironed by someone else, his gold cufflinks glinting beneath the kitchen light like little warnings. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there leaning against the island with one hand flat on the granite, tapping the marble surface with his wedding ring like a ticking bomb. I kept peeling, not because I didn't feel him watching me, but because I refused to give him the satisfaction of flinching. Then came his voice, low and even, the kind of voice men use when they want to control a room without raising it. "Eleanor," he said, drawing out the syllables like my name tasted sour in his mouth. "I think it's time you faced the truth. You're not wanted here. You're not needed. And if you don't leave quietly, I'll make your life very uncomfortable." He smiled when he said it, not a full smile, but the kind that lives halfway between condescension and cruelty, like he thought he was doing me a favor by offering the illusion of choice. I turned to him slowly, laying the paring knife gently on the board, and met his eyes with something colder than he expected. I had buried a child, lived through nights where grief sat on my chest like a stone, and still made breakfast the next morning. I had listened to a woman tell me to pack my bags in the same breath she spoke about estate taxes. I had watched The Room. I once rocked my granddaughter to sleep in, be repainted without a single word, and yet I was still standing. His threat, with all its tailored arrogance, barely registered. I gave him the softest smile I could manage, the kind that older women learn to wear like armor, and said nothing. Silence has weight when it's earned, and mine made him shift his feet. The tart would go in the oven, Ava would come home from school, and I would still be here. Because unlike Graham, I didn't need volume to command a room. I had something better. A letter, a will, and the quiet resolve of someone with nothing left to lose and everything left to protect. The first sign was the photographer, a young woman with a high ponytail and a clipboard, who arrived just after breakfast, to capture the space in its best light. I stood at the sink, rinsing out Ava's cereal bowl, as this stranger snapped photos of the living room I once decorated with James, back when we thought simple things like curtains and cushions could keep sorrow at bay. The second sign was the silence. Vanessa hadn't mentioned anything about selling the house, but I could feel it in the air, the way one feels a storm long before the thunder. She'd been making calls behind closed doors, speaking in clipped sentences and ending conversations with phrases like, "We'll be out before next month." I wasn't supposed to notice, but grief does not dull a woman's instincts. It sharpens them. That afternoon, while Vanessa took Ava to a dentist appointment, I went into town and walked straight into the office of Daryl Pearson, the local real estate agent who'd once helped James negotiate a zoning dispute when he added the garden room. Daryl was older now, his face a little softer around the eyes, but he remembered me. He asked if I wanted to talk in his office or out back where the air was clearer, and I chose the patio, because truth always feels less threatening under open sky. He poured tea from a dented thermos and raised an eyebrow when I told him I believed Vanessa was preparing to sell the house. I could see he already knew. "We just had a listing request come through," he admitted, handing me the cup. I assumed everything was already signed. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft from rereading. It was a copy of the property deed, the one James and I had signed when he first bought the house, back when he insisted that I live with him full-time after Ava was born. "It's subtle," I said, pointing to the second page. "But there it is. Joint tenancy. My name's still on it." Daryl leaned closer, and when he saw it, he let out a low whistle. "She didn't tell me that," he murmured. I sipped my tea and let the silence stretch. Let him do the math. Let him feel the edges of this unexpected truth. Vanessa couldn't sell the house without my consent. Not legally. Not quietly. And not fast. "I'm not here to cause a fuss," I told him, my voice calm. "I just thought you should know before you printed flyers and held an open house on a property that isn't hers alone." He nodded slowly, folding the deed and sliding it back across the table like it was something warm. The wheels were already turning behind his eyes. When I left his office, the sun was low and kind, and the breeze felt lighter than it had in weeks. I didn't need to raise my voice. I only needed to show up with the truth. And the truth, I had learned, is often quiet until it is undeniable. The knock came just after 11, sharp and deliberate, not the friendly rap of a neighbor or the distracted thump of a delivery boy dropping off groceries. I was sitting at the dining table folding Ava's laundry when I heard it, the kind of sound that tells you something is about to change. I opened the door to find a man in a navy jacket, holding a thick envelope with my name printed in bold type, his expression blank with professionalism. He asked me to sign, and I did with a hand that barely trembled, though my heart was knocking harder than his fist ever had. I waited until he was gone, until the footsteps faded and the hum of his car disappeared down the lane, before I closed the door and sat down again at the table. The envelope was warm from the sun, heavy with the weight of every silent moment I had carried since James's funeral. I peeled it open slowly, not out of fear, but reverence, because what lay inside was more than paper. It was the first page of the life I was no longer willing to be pushed out of. Inside were 2 official filings, neatly stapled and bearing the black seal of the county clerk's office. The first was a petition for temporary guardianship of Ava Rose Mathers, filed under emergency review, citing my legal rights as named in James's most recent will. The second was an injunction, a clean and quiet stop sign placed squarely in the path of Vanessa's attempts to sell the house. It was the kind of document that didn't shout but rather pressed gently against the edges of arrogance and said no. I held it in my lap for a long moment, watching the sunlight catch the raised lettering, remembering the nights I had stayed awake, wondering if I was imagining things, if I was being selfish for not wanting to disappear like they expected me to. But this wasn't about bitterness or revenge. This was about love, about promises, about the small girl who still reached for my hand in the dark. I slipped the papers into a folder, tucked them into my drawer beside James's letter, and stood up to put away the laundry. Vanessa returned hours later, her heels clicking across the tile like nothing had changed. She walked past me without a word, her voice rising in the other room as she spoke to someone on the phone about staging furniture and signing papers. I sat down at the piano and played Ava's favourite lullaby, letting the soft notes drift through the house like a warning she would not yet understand. The battle had begun, not with shouting or slammed doors, but with ink, silence, and the quiet resilience of a woman who had been told to leave and instead chose to stay. I have learned that there is a kind of silence in a courtroom that doesn't feel like stillness but like breath being held by every person at once. The wood panelling smelled faintly of old polish and something sterile. And I sat in the second row, hands clasped over my bag, while Vanessa sat 3 seats away in a black dress that was just a little too sleek, a little too rehearsed. Her lipstick was fresh. Her hair was sharp. She looked like someone who believed she had already won. Graham sat beside her, legs crossed, whispering occasionally into her ear, his smugness leaking through the seams of his expensive suit. They had come to watch me fold quietly. They thought this would be a formality. The judge entered, an older woman with tired eyes and a voice like gravel softened by compassion. And as she called the session to order, I felt my heartbeat slow not from fear, but from knowing I no longer had to shout to be heard. David Langston, James's lawyer and friend, stood up and addressed the court with a calm that steadied my spine. He submitted the revised will as evidence, the same one James had signed just months before his heart failed him. The judge adjusted her glasses, unfolded the crisp paper, and began to read aloud. Her voice was measured, careful, every word landing like a stone in a pond rippling through the air. I, James Robert Mathers, of sound mind and body, do hereby state the following revisions to my existing will. I watched Vanessa's face shift as the words moved from standard distributions to specifics, the kind you don't forget. In the event of my passing, I name my mother, Eleanor Mathers, as co-custodian of my daughter, Ava Rose Mathers, and grant her joint legal authority over all educational, medical, and residential decisions. Vanessa stiffened. Her fingers curled around the edge of the bench, but she said nothing. Not yet. The judge kept reading, clause by clause, each one unraveling the illusion Vanessa had built for herself. It was all there, the shared guardianship, the freeze on any home sale without my written consent, the confirmation that I had legal standing, a place not only in Ava's life but in the very foundation of the home Vanessa had tried to sweep out from under me. When the judge finally looked up, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even Graham had stopped whispering. Vanessa's face was pale beneath her perfectly powdered skin. She opened her mouth as if to object, but the judge held up a hand. This will is properly signed, witnessed, and notarized. Its legitimacy is not in question. Mrs. Whitmore, it is binding. And just like that, all her careful choreography fell apart. The room did not erupt. No gasps, no shouting, just the quiet collapse of control, and the sound, barely audible, of a woman finally exhaling after holding her breath far too long. There are moments in a life that hang suspended like drops of rain before they fall, fragile and shimmering with the weight of everything you've ever done to deserve them. I sat in that courtroom chair, back straight, but hands trembling in my lap, as the judge gently asked Ava to step forward. My 10-year-old granddaughter stood in the middle of the room in her school shoes and a cardigan 2 sizes too small, the one she refused to give up. Because I had sewn the buttons on myself after the store-bought ones fell off. Her chin quivered as she glanced at me, then at Vanessa, then at the judge. I saw it in her shoulders, the way she pulled them in like she was bracing against a gust of wind, small and unsure but braver than any child should have to be. The judge's voice was soft, so different from the formality that had filled the room until now. She told Ava there was no wrong answer, that this was only about what made her feel safe, loved, and at home. Ava looked down at her hands, which were clenched into nervous fists at her sides, and for a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the air vent above us. Then she looked up, eyes wide and wet, and said 5 words I will never forget for as long as I have breath in my body. My grandma. She listens to me. The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick. Vanessa's mouth fell slightly open, her carefully rehearsed expression cracking as if those 5 words had struck a fault line deep inside her. Graham shifted beside her, but even he knew better than to speak. The judge nodded slowly, wrote something down, then offered Ava a small smile and thanked her for her honesty. My hands were still trembling, but my heart had grown impossibly full. Ava walked back to the seat beside me and slid her little hand into mine without a word. I didn't squeeze it. I just let it sit there, warm and real, a bridge between everything I had lost and everything I still had to fight for. The judge continued speaking, detailing next steps and temporary custodial guidelines, but her voice faded into the background as I focused on the weight of Ava's hand and the certainty in her voice. She had made a choice, not out of spite or confusion, but because she knew who had listened when she cried, who had remembered the name of her stuffed rabbit, who knew she liked her toast with cinnamon and not jam. I didn't need applause or victory. I only needed what I now held in my hand. And as we left the courthouse side by side, the world felt quieter, not empty, but peaceful, like something had finally been placed back where it belonged. I have learned that when some people lose control, they do not retreat quietly. They claw at the edges of power like it owes them something. It was barely a week after the hearing when the first article appeared online, then another, and then a morning segment on local television, featuring Vanessa sitting stiffly beside a sympathetic anchor, with her lips painted in a soft, maternal pink, and her voice trembling in a way that felt too rehearsed to be real. She said she was a grieving widow, said she was being forced out of her home, said her daughter had been manipulated by a bitter grandmother who could not let go. They used words like unfortunate and tragic, and the headline read, "Custody Controversy Divides Grieving Family." I watched the entire thing with a steady face and a churning stomach. Ava beside me on the sofa tracing shapes into the hem of her shirt. When they cut to a picture of me, taken from my social media profile 3 years ago, I could hear the doubt creep in through the walls. People love a villain when she looks like an old woman with opinions. Vanessa knew that. She was trying to twist the narrative, to paint herself as the victim in a story where she had tried to erase me from the very foundation of my family. But what she didn't count on was James. I went upstairs to my room, opened the drawer where I kept the letter he had written, and read it once more, steadying my breath with every line. Then I called David Langston. By the end of the day, the letter was with a journalist James had trusted years ago during a business ethics scandal, someone who believed in the full truth, not just the convenient parts. 2 days later, the headline changed. Father's letter reveals wishes, in custody case. My mother is Ava's anchor. They printed it in full. His handwriting, his voice, his heartbreak, his hope. Every word cut through the noise like a bell rung in fog. The public turned. Slowly, at first, then with a kind of righteous momentum. Comments flooded in. Emails came. Handwritten letters from strangers who had seen through the performance and felt the truth in James's words. No one could say I had manipulated him. He had spoken clearly, before death, with love and clarity. Vanessa tried to fire back with more interviews, but the tone had shifted. The public saw her now. Not the carefully curated widow, but the woman who tried to silence a grandmother, who ignored a father's plea. And when she called one night and said, low and venomous, through the receiver, "This isn't over," I only smiled. Not because I wanted a war, but because I already knew something she didn't. It never had to be a war. It just had to be the truth. And the truth, once spoken, does not go back to sleep. I have learned that peace does not always come with a trumpet or a parade. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a quiet porch, a creaky gate, and a small stretch of land that finally belongs to no one but you. I moved in the first week of spring, when the air still held a chill, but the crocuses had started poking their purple heads through the thawing soil. The cottage was modest, white with green shutters, a single story tucked at the edge of town near a cluster of maple trees, and a winding path that Ava now calls her secret shortcut. It was not far from the house I had been pushed out of, close enough that Ava could ride her bike between us and still be home in time for dinner, but far enough that I no longer had to hear the click of Vanessa's heels or smell her perfume in the halls where my son once laughed. The sale of the old house had finally gone through after a long and reluctant series of agreements, and though Vanessa had fought to keep control, the will and the public pressure made her settle on terms that gave me what James had intended all along. I used my share to buy the cottage outright. No mortgage, no paperwork tied to anyone else's name. The first thing I did after unpacking was walk barefoot into the garden and turn the soil with my hands. It felt like prayer. I planted tomatoes, rosemary, lavender, and 3 rose bushes in different corners of the yard. By June, the bees had returned. Ava visits every weekend, without fail. She brings her backpack full of drawings, her stories from school, and a collection of mismatched socks she insists I never throw away. We bake on Saturdays and garden on Sundays, and at night she asks me to play the same lullaby on the piano that I used to hum when she was small enough to carry on my hip. I keep her toothbrush in the bathroom, her rain boots by the door, and a copy of her favourite book beside the bed she calls hers now without hesitation. Sometimes she cries when it's time to leave, and I remind her that love isn't measured by how long we're together, but by how safe we feel when we are. She tells me this place smells like cinnamon and clean earth. I tell her that's what home is supposed to feel like. I miss James every single day. But in the morning, when the light comes through the lace curtains and catches the rose petals in bloom, I feel him here, not in grief, but in the life he made possible with his letter, his trust, his quiet belief that I still had something left to give. And he was right. I do. I have love, and roots, and time. I have Ava. I have enough. The room is smaller than the one she used to sleep in when she was a child, but it holds more warmth, more memory, more softness in its corners than any grand space ever could. The window is always cracked just slightly, even in the colder months, because she says she likes the way the air smells out here, like pine needles and bread baking, and something she calls peace. Her posters are crooked, her books spill off the shelves, and her socks never quite make it to the hamper, but it is hers in every way that matters. I still keep the quilt folded at the end of her bed. The one I made when she was 10 with patches of old flannel shirts and cotton scraps from dresses I wore decades ago. And she still pulls it over her lap every time I sit beside her with a book in my hand. Tonight it is an old favourite, one we have read more times than I can count, but she asks for it anyway, because it reminds her of being little, of being held, of being safe. Her voice is deeper now, and her legs spill past the edge of the mattress, but when she curls toward me and rests her head on my shoulder, I see the same girl who once slept with her fists balled tight beneath her chin, afraid of thunderstorms. We take turns reading, trading chapters, laughing when she stumbles over the same word every time. Her laughter fills the room like sunlight pushing into corners that once held grief. I think of James often, especially in moments like this. I think of how fiercely he loved her, how clearly he saw me, how his voice on that page all those years ago gave me the strength to stay upright when everything else tried to fold me in half. I never fought to win. I never wanted trophies or headlines or people to take my side. I fought to matter. I fought so that this room could exist. So that this girl, now a young woman with opinions and courage and a tenderness that still surprises me, would know what it feels like to be listened to be chosen, to be home. When I finish the chapter, she yawns and asks me to stay a little longer. I nod and tuck the book into the drawer with the others, dim the lamp, and sit in the soft chair near her bed, the one that groans a little when I lean back. I watch her drift off, her breath evening out, her fingers still curled around the edge of that patchwork quilt. The moonlight settles on her cheek, like a promise. I close my eyes, not to sleep, but to rest in the quiet, knowing that every step, every ache, every courtroom, every letter, every moment I was told I didn't belong led to this room, this night, this peace. And it is enough.